Up first, those two new reports from Canada's Auditor General. The AG found that $4.6 billion in COVID-19 benefits were paid to people who were ineligible. Of that $4.6 billion, the Canadian government has recovered half, $2.3 billion. But the Auditor General is flagging that a further $27.4 billion of payments to individuals and employers should be investigated further. Now, Canada's management of COVID-19 vaccines also came under scrutiny. The AG found that 13.6 million doses were allowed to expire, and the majority of Canada's current vaccine surplus, some 32.5 million doses, is set to expire at the end of this year. The CBC's Karina Roman has been on this all day, and she joins us now. So, Karina, just how critical was the Auditor General in these reports?
Well, I've read quite a few Auditor General reports in my time, and I wouldn't call this report scathing. It's more of a mixed grade kind of report. On the plus side, when it comes to the benefits, the Auditor General found the government achieved its objective. It avoided a severe contraction of the economy. It avoided a sharp increase in poverty. The benefits went to the people and companies in the sectors most affected. And it was very quick, right? It was quite timely. They got the money out the door quickly. But there was a lack of rigor in the post-payment verification that the government promised would come. So with the time limits that are also incorporated in the legislation that brought in these benefits, they're actually running out of time to do this verification, perhaps recoup some of this money. And you mentioned that $27.4 billion that the Auditor General said should be looked into as possible further waste. Well, the biggest program that contributed to that number is the wage subsidy that went to employers, $15.5 billion of scrutiny that needs to be looked at. And what's interesting is the report says that the CRA is actually missing data that could tell you how effective that program actually was, that they don't actually know whether employees remained with their employers. And so they don't actually know if that program worked. Now, on the vaccine side of things, effective procurement and distribution, very quick, of course, but we ended up with a large surplus of doses. And that led to waste because a lot of these doses, millions of them, expired. And so the Auditor General says that, you know, there's an upcoming risk, as you mentioned, there's more in inventory that also could expire by the end of this year. And there is a race to donate perhaps some of them to other countries, developing countries, but there seems to be a market saturation for those donations. So there isn't the same demand that there used to be. Now, she said two contributing factors really to this is these advance purchase agreements with 7 manufacturers of vaccines was the right approach to take, she said, very prudent approach, but it did lead to overbuying. Like there were more vaccines bought than we needed in the end. But of course, hindsight is 20/20 on that. So she doesn't really, criticize that too much. What she does criticize is our inventory management, and that we really are not using the system that's in place to track the vaccines once they get to the provinces and territories, track their waste and inventory. So we don't know what's out there. We don't know what's going to expire. And that really, really needs to improve and be fixed, she said.
Okay, so that's the Auditor General's top line criticism. What's the government saying in response, Karina? What did the ministers have to say about this today?
So in terms of the benefit side with this post-verification, the ministers insist they are doing post-verification and it is rigorous, but they're trying to balance it with fairness. There are many of the people who received benefits, of course, were in the lower income parts of the economy, and therefore they're probably the least likely to be able to pay it back, especially if it was just a mistake in terms of their eligibility. Carla Qualtrough, the employment minister, said she wouldn't change a thing. She actually said if they had to go back in time, they would do it all over the same way because the goal was always to support Canadians. And you get a sense that if it turned out to be imperfect and a little messy, they're willing to accept that because the actual objective was achieved. There was a lack of answers, however, on the wage subsidy issue and whether they really should be going after perhaps overpayments or payments to ineligible companies from that front. So we didn't get a lot of answers from the ministers on that today. In terms of the vaccines, the health minister, Jean-Yves Duclos, big pat on the back for procurement, thumbs up, we got sufficient supply, timely distribution, equitable access, but he says improvements can and always should be made. He talked a lot about we want to improve our sharing of vaccine data with our provinces and vice versa, them with us. He agrees that a pan-Canadian strategy should be expedited, but not specifics on what would be done differently in the future if we have another situation like this. A lot of talk, of course, about how unprecedented it was, and therefore the response was also unprecedented.
Okay, Karina, thank you so much. This is CBC's Karina Roman in Ottawa. All right, we're going to get more on this. Irek Kusmierczyk is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Employment. He's in Ottawa, and here with me in studio are Adam Chambers. He is the Conservative National Revenue Critic, and Peter Julian. He's the NDP House Leader, and he's here for a second night in a row. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me.
Good to be here.
Mr.
David.
Mr. Kusmierczyk, we heard there that the Auditor General has flagged $27 billion in spending that needs further investigation. How hard is your government going to go after that money in terms of getting it back?
Well, first and foremost, David, we thank the Auditor General for her excellent work. We agree with the recommendations that she's brought forward. And if you look at her report, it actually validates what our government had tried to do during the height of the pandemic, which is our number one goal was to protect Canadians. And so the Auditor General acknowledged as much that the programs that we put forward, I should say, saved countless of lives. They've also saved countless businesses. They saved countless jobs across Canada as well too, and they kept millions of Canadians from actually going into poverty. And so the Auditor General absolutely validated in a lot of ways what was our number one mission, which was to keep Canadians safe and to protect Canadians, their health and safety,
right,
and make sure that they survive this pandemic, this dark time.
On that point, the Auditor General said the programs were effective, but she said they were inefficient. And that's where this money, this $27.1 billion on top of the 4.6, we know went to people who didn't need it or didn't qualify for it, needs some follow-up. So again, back to my question, sir, is like, how aggressive is the government going to be in going after $27 billion that may not have gone to people who should have gotten it?
Well, I can tell you that we were upfront from the very beginning with Canadians that verification was going to come second, that it was going to come after the fact. And our primary consideration at the time, at the peak of this pandemic, when people were losing their jobs, when people were at risk of losing their homes and their livelihood, we wanted to get that money out as soon as possible. That was our number one job. And what I can tell you is out of the $4.6 billion that the Auditor General has identified that went to recipients that were not eligible, about $3.1 billion of that was so-called advance payments. These were sort of the rushed payments that we wanted to get out as quickly as possible. They were attestation based, but I can tell you that we've already recovered close to 50% of those funds. So about $1.35 billion has already been recovered. I can tell you that the work is well underway, and the CRA and ESDC are currently working on, again, verification and recouping some of that funding.
Okay, I want to get your colleagues in here. Adam Chambers, I mean, what would the Conservatives have done differently, maybe up front, to avoid some of this money that is now under question? And what do you make of the response in terms of how aggressive the government can be in trying to get it back?
Well, of course, at the very beginning, the consequences we're seeing of very little, if zero, what they call prepayment verification. So that's before a benefit was provided, what kind of auditing or checks were in the system. Everyone knew at the time, with very little prepayment verification, that there would be some amount that would go to ineligible recipients.
And that was admitted to up front, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I don't think anybody would have believed that almost 15% of the total benefits paid by the government out, which is about $30 billion out of the total 200, would be called into question as potentially going to ineligible recipients. So I think there was a problem with the prepayment verification that was not done. As the COVID extended and the pandemic supports were extended, the government could have taken opportunity to change.
Right.
The Auditor General mentioned that today. She said, look, in particular, the wage subsidy, there were multiple instances where with which the government could have intervened to change that process to make it more rigorous and not relied on the after-payment process verification that they're doing. And now it looks like we're running out of time. We're bumping up against the legislative window with which the government has to recoup some of that payment. So we absolutely need to take this very seriously. There are people on that list who received money through cases of fraud, prisoners, those who are completing some criminal activity, which has since been referred to the authorities. There are lots of people who potentially received the funds through no fault of their own, but through the government mismanagement at the beginning, made an honest but mistaken
there were communication
mistake.
problems and confusion.
Absolutely. That should be separated from perhaps this total $30 billion, but we have a serious problem and a serious amount of money that's called into question.
Mr. Julian?
Well, first, I would like to comment on the vaccines. The fact that 14 million doses of vaccines expired when there are so many poor countries that are looking for vaccines, I find tragic. And the fact that we're now facing another deadline with over 30 million doses, there has been a profound problem with inventory management on vaccines. And that has put people's lives at risk, not only in Canada, but particularly in countries that are poor and that have been seeking access to vaccines that Canada hasn't been providing.
And that's kind of a shared responsibility, federally and provincially, right? Because of the way they both saw it. The feds bought it, but it's the provinces who deliver it.
Certainly.
Yeah.
But the government should have been more energetic because lives are at risk here. This is not something that can be sugar-coated, and I think the Auditor General was quite right in pointing to that. Secondly, in terms of the payments, I mean, the NDP pushed for a lot of these supports. In terms of low-income people that missed that threshold, they might be ineligible because they missed by $50 or $100. I have a number of constituents like that on the income threshold. And we believe, and Jagmeet Singh has called for this, that there should be a low-income amnesty for those payments when people in good faith applied and just narrowly missed the qualifications. Then thirdly, there's the issue of the employer subsidies. And one thing that other countries did that we pressed the government to do and the government refused was to ensure that we had put into place protections so that companies who received this money from the federal government couldn't engage in executive bonuses and stock buybacks and dividend payments. That's not the appropriate use of these funds. And the government really refused to put into place those protections. And that's the bulk of the money that we are talking about. And these are things that were identified that the government should have responded to and the government didn't.
Mr. Kusmierczyk, I wonder if we could pick up on the point of how I understand the chaos of March, April, May of 2020. I mean, the world was changing and money was flying out the door because of the sheer need of it. But by March, April, and May of 2021, we hadn't updated the scrutiny of applicants in a lot of the programs. I mean, why didn't these evolve over time to become more rigorous and actually put some safeguards into the money that was going out the door once this thing was into its second year?
Well, it's a good question, David, and I really like what MP Julian had mentioned, which is basically that, again, especially early on in the pandemic, lives were at risk, and not only were lives at risk, but livelihoods were at risk, and even in the latter parts of the pandemic as well. Too, I can tell you that in my hometown of Windsor, I can tell you that we received so many phone calls from folks that were really concerned about are they going to make it to the end of the month in terms of being able to pay for their mortgage, in order to pay for their rent, in order to pay for their groceries. And so making sure that we were able to get that money.
But was that happening a year in?
As possible.
But by like 1 year in, though, people knew what we were in for, right? So I wonder why there was no effort to really put some guardrails around this thing in a meaningful way, as the Auditor General has said, because a year in, it wasn't that same sense of emergency of cash has got to go out the door or the whole economy is going to crater.
Well, I can still tell you that even in the latter parts of the pandemic as well, too, in communities like ours, we were still shedding jobs, and people were still concerned about their livelihoods. And so making sure that that money flows to Canadians was absolutely critical. But the important part here that I wanted to bring up as well, too, you have to put it into context. There was $116 billion that were paid out to Canadians to help Canadians through the pandemic, through the various programs, whether it was the CERB, whether it was the wage subsidy. And the Auditor General identified $4.6 billion, which is about 4% of that funding in overpayment, of which about almost half of that has already been recovered, and the work continues. The CRA is working right now as we speak to reach out to Canadians and to recover some of that funding. Currently, we have over 100,000 Canadians that are in a flexible repayment program as well too. These are Canadians that were not eligible that are repaying back that funding. So the process continues. The work continues.
Mr. Chambers, there is another $27 billion on top of that $4.6 billion that requires further investigation before we have a full sense of just how much money was improperly obtained.
Absolutely. I think, the Auditor General says it requires investigation. We would agree with that finding. We need to understand also what the CRA is intending to spend in order to recover those payments, like what is the plan to recover those payments. And also, this is relevant because this is the same process, the attestation process, the honor system, if you will, that the government is intending to use and is using for the dental and rental benefits. So this is why we should have answers to these questions. This is the same process which now is called into question that the government wants to use for future programs. And that is primarily the objections that Conservatives had to the dental program that was presented.
Mr. Julian, last word to you.
Well, clear cases of fraud, of course, should be prosecuted. But there are many examples, and I know them in my riding, of people who applied in good faith for the program and missed an income threshold by $100. The government shouldn't be pressing them. They should be looking at the CEOs who took money and applied it inappropriately in a pandemic for things like stock buybacks and executive bonuses. And the government to date seems to be going after regular folks rather than tackling some of the corporate CEOs that may have unjustly and inappropriately used large amounts of money.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Maybe we'll have you back when we get the $27 billion assessed. I want to thank you, Irek Kusmierczyk, Adam Chambers, and Peter Julian. Thanks so much, gang.
Thank you.